For the agent that must be in the know, Medicare Industry Insider discusses critical insight, noteworthy trends, and upcoming issues in the Medicare market.
Deciphering and debating the legislation, regulation, and what's happening in the market. I'm Jalen Jackson.
And I'm Rachel Bremeyer, and we're going to talk shop, dive deep into these complex topics, and make them understandable and actionable.
If you've ever wondered where the world of Medicare is going and how to prepare for the future, Medicare Industry Insider is the resource you've been looking for. We wanted to talk a little bit about caregivers and Medicare beneficiaries, particularly your clients, and really this conversation about who will care for them, how will they receive care, and then what that does to the people that are providing that care. Now, I know we've done a previous episode on skilled nursing facilities, some of the challenges in accessing care and staying in those care situations, but today we wanted to talk about the other very large population of people that provide care to seniors and those with disabilities, and that is typically family caregivers.
Right. Yeah, no, it's kind of interesting looking at the statistics of who needs care. We're looking at 70% of people needing care sometime in their lifetime. And that is going to continue to increase because we're looking at baby boomers getting more and more into the age where they're going to need care. So this is definitely a prevalent topic, and I think a lot of us have experience either seeing a family member or even many of you may even be caregivers yourself. We were just talking too about who is an actual caregiver, and we were talking about the sandwich generation where we're going to run into a lot of 40 and 50-year-olds who are taking care of their children at home and then also have their parents that they're trying to take care of. And part of that is just access to long-term care facilities, where we had talked about in a previous episode of just there's not enough. There's not enough facilities, enough space in general for people to get care in a facility. So the likelihood of someone being a caregiver is not only increasing, but it's almost an epidemic of it's going to happen.
Absolutely. Some recent statistics I saw indicated that on average, someone might need care that probably should have been provided in a facility setting for on average around 2 years before they're actually placed in a facility. Now, sometimes that's a financial issue. Sometimes it's just, that state of denial of wanting to remain at home as long as possible. But at the end of the day, there are these family members, whether it's a spouse or children or even just family friends, providing this at-home care most of the time completely uncompensated and often to their own detriment.
Yeah. No, it's crazy. We were looking at some statistics, and 57 to 81% of the caregivers are women. And unfortunately that, you're looking at around 40, 50-year-old women who a lot of them are still in their careers. Some of them are taking care of kids at home. And that is just, it's an interesting dynamic, especially with the workforce. That means those people are more than likely going to be trying to work and maybe need some flexibility with their employers, whether it be time off, part-time, maybe taking off to take their family member to the doctor, to the hospital, and just being available for them. Potentially it's working remote. So I think that's definitely going to shift our employer dynamic too, of what does that mean to be an employer and have an employee who is a caregiver? It's going to shift completely, especially as boomers continue to get older and more people are going to be taking care of that generation as well.
Absolutely. I mean, over the next 7 to 8 years, we're going to see kind of the last phase of baby boomers turning 65. And by the time we get to the end of that baby boomer generation, those early baby boomers, those, those 1945 and later, they're going to be well into their 80s. We're going to be looking at the folks that are really in that realm where they will start to need care. And we're looking at the generation coming up behind them that'll be providing that care being a much smaller generation. So I think especially as you look at people living longer, staying healthier longer, you're going to have a lot of folks like, even myself, I'm already starting to look at, okay, what happens when my wife and I have to take care of both of our sets of parents? We've got one child, but we're about to have 4 parents that we may need to take care of in the future. So that's a huge burden to prepare for, especially if you're not in a position where you can prepare for it financially through, whether that's through long-term care products or some other kind of pre-planning need. And we were just talking earlier about, okay, whose house do you move into? Is it, do you have steps? Do you have stairs? Is it multi-level? Is it, inconvenient for living with someone who may have a disability? My father has multiple sclerosis, so that's, at some point it is very likely he'll end up in a wheelchair. And, even 6 years ago when we bought our house, that was one of the things we were thinking about. Ranch style home, single level.
And who thinks about that
happened,
when you're in your 20s and 30s? Like, I'm buying a house to make sure that I can give adequate care if I am a caregiver with my parents, and like getting those, modifications to your home, whether that be something like where everything's all on one level, or ramps, or can they get into the shower? Is it all on one level? It is interesting, and speaking of personal stories, my family just went through all of that as well. My grandma ended up living alone because her husband passed away, and that was something she was very proud of. And then she ended up falling. So a simple solution would be let's move her closer to home, and let's find an unassisted living, or basically a place where she could stay. That's close by. Well, that's very, very difficult to find. We actually found out it's just like daycare. We both of us have dealt with that, trying to find a daycare and get on waiting lists and everything. It's the same scenario for the aging population. If you want to get them in an unassisted living or assisted living, you're on a wait list. So she ended up at my parents' house, and they did the same thing that you were just talking about with like, okay, what room are they putting her in? It's got to be on the same level. So they ended up actually redoing their house so that she could have a bedroom in the house that did not, because before it was kind of a bedroom you had to go through to get to a bathroom. So they split the bedroom up and made it a hallway, so the bathroom was on the other side so that people weren't going through her room. And then on top of that, you've got, the things that they're constantly worried about. She was constantly worried about her house because we didn't sell it right away. And she didn't have the energy to go through all of her things, but she was worried about them. So we were constantly having that discussion with her, and she was living with my parents, so they're on top of each other. My brother ended up moving back in around the same time, so my mom was very much a sandwich generation. She was thankfully not working at the time. My dad was providing, but it took us 2 years to get her into an unassisted living location, and she loved it when she got in there, but it was just the matter of the time it took, and then on top of that, the stress that I saw my mom going through. It aged her quite a bit, just being a caregiver to her child and to her mom at the same time, and just, not ever getting a break. Even if she went somewhere, my grandma couldn't drive. So, okay, are we isolating her to this house for 2 years, or is she coming with my mom? So it was like, she would go grocery shopping. My grandma would come with her. So she just never had alone time. And I think that's the stress and pressure and exhaustion that you see in caregivers is something that it's a real thing.
Well, it's almost like, every time, usually like right before they leave office, you'll always see those like side-by-side pictures of presidents when they came into office and then when they left. It's like longest 4 years of their life. And I think caregiving can be a lot like that. It's like you said, that constant high-stress situation definitely ages people abnormally, it seems like. And, you're right, the waiting times to get into some of these facilities, like you said, this was just an unassisted living, senior living community type place. I know there's a lot of folks who, in this baby boomer generation, we've got an incredible number, around 9 million veterans in that senior population, primarily Vietnam vets right now. But those are all folks that I know a lot of my clients back when I was out in the field as an agent talked about, hey, if I ever need that, I can go to the VA home. Well,
is there space now?
There is no space. I mean, even back then, the waiting list for the VA, long-term care facility was 2+ years easily. And that was almost a decade ago. And, we're also looking at here in the state of Missouri, there's only 8 veterans homes in the state of Missouri. They have combined about 150 beds. It's just not a viable solution for a lot of people. And I think there's a lot of folks that kind of make the assumption that things will be taken care of, putting a lot of other, additional pressures on those caregivers without ever taking the time to talk about making a plan.
Yeah, and actually coming along with the plan, we'd even discuss like the cost it takes to be a caregiver. Like, my parents were talking about that quite a bit, of like feeding her, and like my mom would take her shopping and not ask for money back. And on top of that, just the day-to-day, gas to take her to, all of her doctor appointments or hair appointments or anything that she had going on, the time that it takes, like it's just all the extra things that you don't think about. It's basically like going back in time to having, a teenager where they're in activities and they're eating out of house home. And basically that's the same thing. You've got a person who may or may not be able to contribute with your daily chores, probably causing more mess, and then also eating food and using your own money to buy clothes and gas and everything like that. And has that even been discussed? Sometimes that's not even a discussion. And then if you've got multiple siblings, that can cause a lot of tension too, if one sibling is a caregiver and the other one is not. So it is an interesting dynamic that I think it's important to discuss and to talk about. And then in addition to that, you've got the legal side.
Sure.
That a lot of people don't even sit down and talk about, making sure that they've got medical power of attorney and not just financial, which I think is something that a lot of people don't sit down and think about. I'm going to die someday or I'm going to get sick someday. That's something nobody wants to think about.
Yep.
So they're not preparing as well as they should be.
Well, and I think to your point, especially when you have multiple potential caregivers or, whether it's siblings or whoever it is, I think that's one of the biggest discussions to have up front is who gets to make the decisions, because you really need to head that off at the pass, so to speak, and make sure that they're not going to be a lot of infighting about what do we do with care for mom or dad or whoever it is, and how to handle the situation. And I've seen a lot of people try to set things up in like a checks and balances where one person makes health decisions, one person makes financial decisions, and all that ends up doing is causing a lot of headbutting and really can destroy not only family dynamics, but it can also result in worse outcomes for that Medicare beneficiary as people argue and causes delayed access to care.
That's interesting too. Not only the dynamic, but I think I was looking at statistics and it said that only 25% of people actually have put together a will or trust. And so we're talking about, the legal side, setting up durable and financial, medical, all the different types of POAs that you can set up. Well, 75% of people probably haven't even done that. So that's another aspect too of like, if someone were needing a medical decision made, half the people haven't even made that decision or have a person to make that decision. So especially for a caregiver, making sure that parent or whoever that is that you're caretaking for has that set up, because it's something that can completely destroy a family. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think, the big call to agents here is really to just have these discussions with your clients, work with your strategic partners, your elder law attorneys and people like that, to just kind of get them connected. Because I think the biggest thing I used to see as an agent was some people might even go so far as to set these things up, but they never revise them. I can't tell you the number of times that I would sit down with a client and we'd be looking through their old life insurance policies, and their spouse that died 6 years ago was still their beneficiary on their life insurance.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? Probably still the primary beneficiary in their will, probably still the primary beneficiary or power of attorney for them. If they were sensible enough to set that up, they probably did it all at once, and it probably needs updated. Yeah. So that's kind of the other discussion to have, is making sure that, it is family dynamics change, whether that's through death, divorce, whatever the case may be. So making sure that your planning is dynamic as well is going to result in better standards of care. If someone is trying to age in place and be able to stay at home as long as they can, I think that's going to be absolutely critical to that planning process, is making sure that you have a plan in place to kind of review your own plan of care on a regular basis to make sure it's still meeting your needs.
100%. You actually brought something up as an agent, networking with attorneys who do elder law or financial planning, trusts, that kind of thing, all of the different aspects that go along with keeping that person healthy and not financially devastated. And then in addition to that, having the right people taking care of them if they need it. I actually had one agent reach out and say, okay, I would like to network with attorneys. How do I go about doing that? And this was an angle that they could go into it with, of like talking to them about making sure that, they had their beneficiary set up, that the beneficiary had their contact information, that, the will and trust was all put together, that there was a medical directive in there as well, and understanding the importance of having that as well. And so in addition to that, just the legal aspect of like, is everything in one place? If the beneficiary knows who the attorney is, they may not know who the agent is, and kind of having that nice connection. That's usually one of the first places people go, if they are dealing with a caregiver situation, whether that be that they're, in a long-term care facility, incapacitated, whatever, speaking to an attorney. If the attorney has the agent's contact information, that's a nice next step in connecting all of those. So I definitely think the legal side of this as an agent, having that connection is going to help more than hurt in terms of your relationship with your clients as well.
Absolutely.
So you were talking about the president coming in and going out, and they had, colored hair when they came in, and then they had gray hair when they came out.
Sure.
Another aspect of caregiving is respite care. It's one of those things that is built in to Medicare, but it's such a limited amount of time that person gets off. And having a break is so important as a caregiver, and that just... and I think that's what they realize too. That's probably why it's built into a lot of insurance plans. But literally, Medicare will only cover respite care on an occasional basis, up to 5 days at a time. And you and I were actually just talking about, is it even an option? Is respite care even an option, especially if they're in a rural area?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like it goes back to that access to care discussion that we've had on so many other episodes. Is, it's fantastic. You can have the best insurance in the world. If there's no one to provide that service in your area, you're still kind of out of luck.
Right.
There's a reason that people travel for care, and it's not always just quality. Sometimes it's simply, is care available where I am? And I think with respite care especially, a lot of smaller rural communities, they're not going to have adult daycare programs. They're not going to have, maybe just extra quote unquote home health workers and things like that, that may be able to help provide that care. So I think even if you can get coverage for it, finding someone to provide that care can be really difficult. And again, that's where some of this advanced planning comes into place. And, again, it's a lot of family stress. I've got two siblings. I know it's conversations we've already started having with our parents again. And, we all kind of know where things stand at this point. But, again, things change.
I feel like you're rare, though. Like, how many people have kids in their, 20s and 30s, and they're like, okay, let's have a conversation about this. Like, I wish everyone did. But,
absolutely.
Thank God
I have the burden of knowledge from working in the industry.
I'm sure you were the one who started that conversation. So you're like, come on, Mom and Dad, let's sit down and have this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's it's not a fun one to have, but just you see enough people struggle with this exact thing, and it's really an unavoidable conversation. And I think the biggest thing for me is, as an agent, one of the things I used to do all the time is I called them beneficiary appointments, and it started out usually with like a life policy or something like that. There's a beneficiary listed on there. It's a son, a daughter, an aunt, an uncle, a cousin, somebody that client obviously cares about enough to potentially leave a legacy to. And that's the perfect person to get in touch with, at least to start the conversation with, about caregiving and long-term planning. So obviously, with your client's permission, I highly recommend folks get together with their clients and say, hey, listen, who is going to fill that role, or who would you like to fill that role? Because again, a lot of times that client of yours may have never had this conversation, may just be expecting someone to provide that care. And that's a situation that you don't want them to get into if all of their planning is based on an unspoken expectation, and then it comes to find out that it's not a possibility because of, like we said, a lot of caregivers, even right now, work full-time jobs. Maybe they can't afford to give up that job or cut back hours or turn down that promotion. There's a lot of things that can kind of put a wrench in the gears and slow down or eliminate those options. So meeting with that client, talking about who are those folks, who are your beneficiaries that you want to leave a legacy to, who do you want to provide care to you, and then setting up a meeting and say, let's just get all of us around a table together. As your agent, I want them to know me, because I'm going to be the one who gets a phone call. If you're in the hospital and can't answer questions and they can't figure out the insurance, I'm going to get that phone call. It would be really beneficial if the person they're calling is not a complete stranger. So it'd be nice to just meet them, and we can kind of have a talk about, what your kind of package of protection looks like, what it is covering, what it's not covering, and what they can expect as they step into that caregiver role as you age.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point of, if anything were to happen with your clients, do they know who to contact?
Sure.
And I think that is something that is a gap in a lot of people's CRMs. I don't know if the CRM has a little spot. You mentioned you have
absolutely.
a tracking form that you would fill out and ask that question. I think that's important as an agent to add that question if it's not on a tracking form or if it's not in your CRM. Who is your beneficiary? And then in addition, not only just gathering it for yourself, but making sure you reach out. So I love that you had that beneficiary meeting, that you then gathered their potential caregiver in the future. Because in addition to that, most agents have additional products. That's an opportunity for you to get in the door with those potential caregivers,
Sure.
whether it's the kids or nieces, nephews, whoever is taking care of them. But in addition, if something were to happen, that's the scariest thing, to be a caregiver and not know what's covered, what's not covered, how they're going to financially prepare for that, and having a conversation with you saying, oh, they've got this plan, here's how this is taking care of it, make sure to ask these questions. How much relief is that as a caregiver to know, okay, I've got you in my back pocket to ask questions.
Sure.
So I think you're completely right, and hitting the head on gathering that emergency contact information for a potential caregiver down the road.
Yep. And like we already mentioned, great time to bring in some of those strategic partners, because the first thing clients and their beneficiaries or caregivers need to realize is if they don't have that power of attorney set up, if they don't have some maybe prior authorizations put into place, that caregiving is going to be a lot more difficult, because you can't just call up an insurance company and say, hey, I want to talk about my mom's insurance. That has to be authorized, which means either mom has to be able to answer questions and say, yeah, you can talk to them, which may or may not be the case, or you have to have some kind of, most carriers will have some kind of prior authorization or authorized representative form that can be submitted ahead of time to say, yes, this person can call and get information about my plan, answer questions, ask questions, change billing info, all of that kind of stuff. And I think that's a critical missed step for a lot of people, is just setting that up in advance to make sure that there's no waiting period, while we try to get the paperwork together and get everything submitted. And, heaven forbid you've got someone that you're caregiving for and they're incapacitated in a way where they can't sign papers. Well, now we've got to go through the court process and establish guardianship. And then it can take months, all the while they're not getting the care they need.
Right. I think as an agent too, you brought up a good point of all the different people that touch that caregiver and establishing relationships with all of those people. You can even put a little circle and put caregiver and then draw lines around it of anyone who would touch that caregiver. That's a perfect person to network with and make sure that they have your contact information, because if that caregiver is talking to them, they're more than likely also going to ask that person that they already trust for recommendations for an agent too. And how much better is that to be a person in your community that is the go-to person for any insurance questions to help them financially take care of that, whether they be the caregiver or the client. So 100% recommend that. And I think you did bring up a good point, that just having all of those different aspects and pre-planning and making sure your clients do as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's really just to kind of bring it all home. The big call to action for this whole episode to me is just over communicate everything. Get together with your clients to have these kind of pre-planning discussions. Make sure that you're in touch with anyone who is going to deal with that person's care. But both you and the caregiver need to be working in those circles to establish relationships. And then also just providing resources.
Right.
A lot of great caregiver resources out there. I know we'll have some in the show notes, but working with folks like most states have a long-term care ombudsman program that can help with access to resources and information about long-term care services in your area, as well as helping with avoiding elder abuse and looking at complaint indexes and things like that. So I mean, I think it's as with everything we do as agents, at the end of the day, like if what we're selling is a product, we're pretty much always going to lose. We're selling our knowledge, we're selling our resources, we're selling that kind of that peace of mind that we provide
100%.
by knowing you've got someone in your corner. And caregivers need someone in their corner probably more than anybody else.
Right. So I think just to kind of wrap it all up, 70% of people are going to need some sort of caregiver taking care of them in their future. That's according to the U.S. Administration on Aging. It's crazy how many people are going to need it. So I think as an agent, taking care of everyone, being a resource, and selling yourself, making sure people are planning is a good, perfect summary. So with that, I think we're going to bid you adieu. Hope you attend the next Medicare Industry Insider, and we thank you so much for watching.